Thank you very much. Can you hear me like this? Okay, thank you. Well, I'm very grateful to you, first of all, for inviting me here. And as I say, it's the second time I'm taking part in the Heinrich Böll Memorial Weekend, but I also had the pleasure and the privilege of spending 2 weeks in the Heinrich Böll Cottage itself, the most wonderful place. I just revisited it today. It has been redecorated so beautifully, and everything that you do here is just wonderful. As you might know from the program, my friend Hans-Henner Becker was supposed to interview me. It should have been a public interview. I'm here on my own on the podium. I'm so sorry. He is not very well, and I'm sure he would be very grateful if he knew that we are sending him our very, very best wishes. It means, however, that he who would have steered me very safely through that conversation has to be back in Berlin, whereas I have to muddle through on my own, even though it's only 30 minutes. What I thought I would do is I give you a few poems, and either in the original and the translation or in the English translation only, and say a few words about them and say a few words about the process of translation. That's all we can do, actually. He would have fired at me 1,000 clever questions, and possibly I could have answered some of them, but now he's not here. I have to do it my own. Thank you. Okay, first of all, in honor of our patron saint, Heinrich Böll, I would like to read 3 poems of his in my English translation made for this particular occasion. Now, it could be that Michael Augustin, who was here some time ago, that he also read poems by Heinrich Böll in his translation. I'm not too sure. Many people, many readers of his novels and short stories do not know that Heinrich Böll wrote some poems, maybe 80 altogether. And in fact, René Böll was co-editor of the latest edition of the collected poems about 4 years ago. And the first one is called Meine Muse, My Muse. And as we know, traditionally, the Greeks and many people after them invoked the muse, or one of the 9 muses, and maybe for poetry it was Euterpe. And there would be goddesses, you know, from the Greek myths. Heinrich Böll actually inverts all of that and turns his muse or muses into very worldly figures. And if you like, there are 7 of them in his poem, Meine Muse. And they are a street vendor, a nun, a working class factory girl, an old hag, a housewife, a leper. And then, funnily enough, the last stanza says, Meine Muse ist Deutsche. Suddenly a completely different level. Anyway, I read that in my translation, and later on I will say a few words about some problems maybe that one might encounter. My Muse, written in 1965. My muse stands at the corner. She gives everyone cheaply what I don't want. When she is cheerful, she gifts me whatever I like. Rarely have I seen her cheerful. My muse is a nun in a somber house behind a double grill. She puts in a word for me with her beloved. My muse works in a factory. When she is done with her work, she wants to go dancing with me. Being done with one's work, for me, that's not a question of time. My muse is old. She rubs me over the knuckles, shrieks with a leathery mouth. In vain, you fool, in vain. My muse is a housewife. She stacks words, not linen, in the press. She rarely opens the doors and hands me one. My muse is a leper, just like me. We kiss the snow from each other's lips, declare one another to be clean. My muse is German. She offers no protection, and when I bathe in dragon's blood, she puts her hand on my heart. Thus I remain vulnerable. And you will recognize in the last stanza that old myth of Siegfried, who kills the dragon, but one particular part of his body, namely his shoulder blade, is not covered by the dragon's blood, so Hagen later on can come along with a spear and kill him. Another poem, and it's a shame that René is not here, is about the three sons of Heinrich Böll from 1982. One has to say Heinrich Böll wrote his first poems when he was a very young man, and then later on in age, quite a number of so-called occasional poems, but this is basically a little declaration of love for his three sons. Never forgotten. Never forgotten. Never have I forgotten the strong, the beautiful, the dependable hands of my sons. Yours, Rai, on Croagh Patrick, that saved me from falling on slippery scree. René's and Vincent's hands that in Quito carried me aboard the plane, high up into the jumbo jet. Never forgotten the hands of my sons, mine so weak they couldn't hold. And maybe just a word about that last line, they couldn't hold. That is a literal translation of the German. Meine Hände, so schwach, konnten nicht halten. That could be ambiguous. It could mean they couldn't hold anything. They couldn't hold on to anything. They couldn't last and live longer. So it's very difficult to capture those various aspects of meaning in the one word, but maybe the English is open enough. And the last one by Heinrich Böll. In his honor, tonight we will read poems in honor of Paul Döcken. It's for his granddaughter Samai, for Samai from 1985 as well. We come from afar, dear child, and have to go far. Fear not, all are with you that went before you. Your mother, your father, and all that went before them. Far, far back, all are with you. Fear not, we come from afar and have to go far, dear child. Now, another poet who spent also, I think, a fortnight here, I don't know in which year, in the Heinrich Böll cottage, Eva Christina Zeller from Tübingen. We hope to be able to bring out a selection of her poetry in possibly, hopefully, next year. And there's one here that was written in the Böll House and is about the Böll House. So I thought it might be quite fitting. And just for those of you who have some German or are German, there's one word in the third stanza, das Gräbele. Now that's a Swabian expression. If they want to use, terms of endearment, they always attach a L at the end. In Franconia, for example, in Bamberg, they put a La at the end. So, for example, if you go for a bread roll, it's ein Brötler, La. In Swabia, L. So, the word Gräbele. I'm not sure, Gisela, whether you ever experienced that, but when a child sleeps between the parents in the so-called Bettritze, or sometimes Gästeritze, that could be called a ditch, and the German word for ditch is Graben, and the diminutive is Gräbele in the Swabian dialect. Now, that, of course, one cannot render properly. I don't even know whether you have a word in English for that. But that sequence of poems about Achill Island is in its entirety called, and I hope you will forgive me for my pronunciation of the Irish, Edith Achara, the in-between place. So what I then did in my, own way, instead of saying or finding some English word for Gräbele, I opted for this Irish expression, thereby associating it also with the title of that particular sequence. So, the poem is called Waiting for the Spirits. Heinrich Böll Cottage, Dugard, Achill Island. The spirits muttering in the underfloor heating. We place seawater towels on their hot foreheads. You too, Heinrich. liked the trembling fuchsias, God's tears forever tinkling. Poems multiply on the bookshelves. At the peat fire, I still believe in the power of their smallest units. Dreams lose their cruelty. Tonight, my mother was lying next to me, and I not in the Edith Ahra. Hence my fondness for the edges of the world. John, the caretaker, says, God bless you, when he takes his leave. And there's one last one about a fox. And then I will say something more general, but only in a very few words. And it's called On the Way to the Crossroads Cafe. The fox under the fuchsias by the roadside, shreds of pelt, bits of bones and body, white tail tip, white snout, looks at you with unseeing eyes. A relief on the verge. Every day you walk past it, every day it sinks further into the soft ground. Old or very young, the little fox mowed down, wiped out. I said something about the word gräbele and my substitute for it, in this case in the Irish language. Now, I have a certain credo when it comes to translation, and some people think it's a little bit weird, because on the one hand, I believe in the sanctity of the original text that is to be translated, be that a poem or a novel or a short story or an essay or whatever. In other words, I try to work in the spirit of utter, not faithfulness, that's a difficult term, but of utter loyalty, that I try to capture the spirit and the body, that is the physical body, that is the words of the text, of the original. That's the one thing. Some people feel much freer in their dealings with the original, move away as the mood takes them. I try to stick very, very closely as far as the German language, or in this case the English language, allows. But on the other hand, I believe in the autonomy and the sovereignty of the translating subject as a creator of, hopefully, a new work of art. And maybe I can show you that in the case of the next poem by an English poet, Adrian Motion, this time the other way around, from the English original to my German mother tongue, where I try to be, as I say, as faithful to the form of the poem as well as to what you might call the content, the intention, the meaning, the sense of the poem. But at the same time, because sometimes you work, within the constraints of your own language, I tend to intensify something that's already there, but possibly not explicit in the original poem. And I'll give you an example for that now. And for that I have to open, because I forgot my laptop, I have to open my little mobile phone. Adrian Motion, for those who don't know, was the English poet laureate for about a decade, or precisely a decade. So obviously he had to write poems about, births and deaths within the royal family and stuff like that. But he also wrote this poem called Song, very simply Song, and it's song number 6. And it is a love poem, but it's not a love poem about a lover, a beloved, or by a lover, a beloved. It is love, him or herself, or itself, that speaks to the subject, what we call the lyrische subject, to the speaking voice in the poem. So it goes like that in the original, and maybe you should particularly listen to biblical allusions, because that will play a role in what I then call intensification in the German. Andrew Motion's Song 6. Love spread out its summer in my head, and silkily, with eyes half shuttered, said, believe me, though I sometimes disappear, or lose my way, or hardly seem to care, I am the golden rule, the only law which keeps its value, and the single shore surrounding all your seas of wreck and storm. Believe me, though I sometimes do you harm, or speak in tongues, or trammel up your time, I am the perfect reason and the rhyme for everything. I mend the broken lock and strike fresh water from the stubborn rock. I turn the ice to fire, the ash to wood. I am the only fountainhead of good. Believe me, though I sometimes turn my back and leave you to those passionate attacks you make upon each other for my sake. Believe me, though the earth's foundations shake, I am your journey when your journey is done. I am your end before you have begun. So, love speaketh, and does so in rhyming couplets. Dudum, dudum, dudum. Now, obviously, that puts the onus of the translator to imitate, to reproduce that rhyming pattern as best as one can. And then comes the cul-de-sac, where you don't find your way out. That word will not rhyme with that word. So I invented something, or rather I didn't invent something, but I went one step further than Andrew Motion. You might have heard to speak in tongues, which is a direct quotation from the Bible, from the New Testament. And then the other one was strike fresh water from the stubborn rock. Now that is Moses in the Old Testament with his staff, or his, I don't know what you call it in English, knocking at the rock, and suddenly the people of Israel have fresh water. So he has the word, the only law which keeps its value. So I thought, if there are these biblical references, I will carry them further, because I needed a word that rhymes with the fairly high-ranking word Gestade for shore or bank or whatever. Gestade. You will know Gestade. And then I came up with Bundeslade, which is the Ark of the Covenant, in which were supposed to be contained the Ten Commandments, the two, what do you call them in English, die Tafeln? Thank you, the tablets with the Ten Commandments. So I thought, if he does that, I can do that as well, and I will go for it and will not feel guilty, and will feel that I have here followed the spirit of that poem to really come up with the strongest possible language. Now, Israelis or Jews might call me blasphemous by saying love contains the highest law, because it should be God's, obviously. But I think one can do that and be blasphemous. Song 6. Die Liebe hat auf mich den Sommer ausgegossen. Nun spricht sie sanft zu mir, die Augen halb geschlossen. Glaube mir, auch wenn ich hin und wieder fliehe, vom Weg abkomme oder mich der Pflicht entziehe, ich bin die goldene Regel, bin die Bundeslade, die ihren Wert behält, das einzige Gestade, das alle deine Meere, Sturm und Wrack umschließt. Glaube mir, auch wenn ich dich ins Unglück stieß, in Zungenrede und dir keine Zeit gewinn, ich bin der erste Grund und bin der letzte Sinn von allem. Das zerbrochene Schloss flick ich allein und schlage frisches Wasser aus dem spröden Stein, verwandle Eis zu Flammen, zu Holz die Aschenglut. Des guten Urquell bin ich und das höchste Gut. Glaube mir, Auch wenn ich euch den Rücken kehre und dulden muss, dass eins das andere versehre mit jener Leidenschaft, die ich euch eingegeben. Glaube mir, auch wenn der Erde Festen beben, ich bin die Reise nach aller deiner Reisen Last. Dein Ziel bin ich, noch ehe du begonnen hast. So, I think whatever else one might think about the merits or demerits of the translation, but I think I did succeed in one regard, and that is to preserve, on the one hand, the form, the given form of the original, and on the other hand, not to falsify, but to intensify what you might call, for want of a better word, the content. And obviously, whatever I'm saying in these very few minutes, we have only very few minutes left, obviously one, as a translator and possibly also as an author, one has to appeal to the readership at large to understand that whenever they read anything, not only in regard to poetry, but also, as I said before, novels, short stories, etc., whenever they read something or anything in translation, that they never ever read the original. Many people, many readers have this naive belief that when they read a novel in translation, that they have access, unfiltered access to the original. That is not so. And that is not so because of the very reason that I gave you, that the intervening subject is an autonomous subject, even though he or she is bound by the sanctity of the original text and also by the constraints imposed upon them by, for example, in my case, the rules of German grammar, of German vocabulary, etc., etc. And of course, by the personality of the translating subject. I mean, we are all shaped by our experiences, be they life experiences or literary experiences. What have we read? How large or limited is our vocabulary? How great are we in terms of grammar, punctuation, whatever you might call it? We come with our limitations. I mean, sometimes, we talk about the ethos of translation, and quite often then we are talking about political correctness. Is this allowed? Is that allowed? But it goes far further than that, in the sense that I cannot be anyone other than who I am. Same as the author, in his or her case. So that means whatever I can deliver to the reading public in Germany is limited by those confines within which I find myself. Now, an engineer, possibly the same thing. He can or she can do so and so many things, but possibly not build that bridge. So it needs another engineer. I don't know. All the same, just to finish off with one or two words about myself, and then maybe you have a question or two. You said, I did this, I did that, and then I started translating. It's not quite so. My very first translation came out many, many decades ago, and it was a poem by another Englishman, Adrian Mitchell, called Revolution, and it was printed. And I thought, wow, something that I wrote, even though secondhand, so to speak, is printed, I should I not follow that up with some more things? And so it went bit by bit and by and by. And now I think this year I will have my 200th book translation, which is quite a considerable body of work. And the interesting thing for you here in Ireland is that I think I can claim that it is particularly Irish literature. I think I've translated now 35 Irish authors in book form and more than 100 in, little things like poems or an essay here or a short story there. So there is a special relationship, shall we say, between this country and myself in all sorts of regards, but particularly in terms of the literary plane. Okay, we stop here because it's almost past. If there's any question, fire it at me, because Hans-Christian Becker is not here, so you can step in and do his work for him. Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry.
What?
This is a very quick question. Between German and English, a dog barking is never in German. I can't remember what it is, but it doesn't sound anything like bow wow, which isn't what dogs sound like anyway. They make a completely different sound. There's always a problem. but in the 1950s there was I think it was Belgium called Franz Witter, who did performance things which gave the sound of thunder. And he had a long series of syllables, and it gave you the complete sound palette of that actual sound, where you hear in a valley, you'll get the reflections coming back and they're a bit quieter, and then it may hit a cliff face and it's stronger, and you get all these subtleties of sound. How do you, or things that, like smells, which are totally, or colours which are unidentifiable, because the Greeks say they didn't have a colour for blue, or that kind of thing, where they said the red blue sea or whatever, there was one of the colours actually.
Well, in a sense, I think you should ask all authors, and more than that, all of us people, you know, how, if you tell a story and you say, oh, the ocean had a particular color today, you know, which are the words, or in that sense, or in that regard, which are the sounds, you know, that you can muster. I mean, that's the problem, of course. The languages deal with sounds, let's say, the dogs barking differently. A cock will crow so differently in French from what he will do in English or German or Chinese, for all I know. So that's a different question that, in a sense, is about the nature of language altogether. You know, I mean, that also goes back then to the origins of language. Could it be that language in the past, in the very distant past, originated from the first little sounds that the humans to be made, you know? And it's always controversial whether humans became humans because they did have language, or was it the other way around, you know? Same with about tools, about social cohesion, etc., etc. So that goes into sort of very philosophical dimensions, and I cannot answer your question. Yeah.
In your experience, do translations from English to German go further in terms of readers than from German to English?
How do you mean? What do you mean by further?
In terms of its acceptance. Say, for example, if you translate a book from German into the English language, does it sell? Does it get read, or is it more so if it goes from English to German that it's read more in German?
Well, that depends entirely on the individual author. If you are called Sally Rooney, you will sell in Germany. Now I don't want to mention any names, if you are called XYZ, maybe even the novel that was a success in either Ireland or overall in the English-speaking world might not be a success in the German-speaking world, because possibly either, you know, things like advertising the book didn't work out, or it could be that culturally it doesn't appeal as much to that particular readership as it does to another.
The reason I ask that question is that I've met over the years German writers coming through the Dublin College, and they complain that when the books are translated, they may be quite well achieved well in German. When they're translated into English, you know, 12 people come to a reading in London or Dublin.
Yeah. I mean, that's another problem, that Germany, in my perception, is now at a stage where, you know, the English language is so embraced, especially by the younger generation, that quite often there isn't the patience anymore for the German translation, not only in terms of time, but altogether as an enterprise. Why should there be a German translation if I can read the English novel in the original? Obviously, that only applies to English, unfortunately, because French, or let's say all the non-European languages, you know, nobody speaks them by and large. But English is such, such a universally accepted language now that even in literary terms, you know, for example, I hear that about the Netherlands. They have to bring out the Dutch translation, if possible, before the English original, because otherwise people will flock to bookshops in order to purchase the English translation, you know. But also when you said further, maybe in terms of, yeah, what a book can carry. I mean, why is it, let's say, that a Chinese novel, right, can appeal to me as a German? Why is it that a French novel can appeal to a Japanese audience, or maybe an Irish? Let's say, for example, I discovered, so to speak, for the German market, Maeve Brennan, right? And on the one hand, one could say she's so specifically Irish in her short stories set in Dublin about married couples with children or with one child, and the conflicts within the relationship, etc. But it's very Irish and very Catholic and very suppressed and all that. Why should that, in the year 2000 and whatever, appeal to a German audience? But then, of course, you could answer that by saying because the way the author portrays those characters, the language she employs is so, I would almost say, devastating, that it can appeal to anyone in a completely different situation because of the observation of human behavior altogether. And it goes cross-gender, and it goes cross-nationality, and it goes cross-language. And that, I think, is the power of literature, to be able to arouse empathy or at least interest in something that's completely foreign, either to the audience at large or to you as a person. And in that sense, I'm very, very glad and possibly sometimes even proud to be a translator in order to be able to, facilitate that channeling, which otherwise, as we all know, wouldn't happen unless everybody in the world speaks English, and that's it. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this insight. It's really, really interesting. As a reader, do you enjoy reading a translated text more or less or differently than reading a text in its original language?
Well, that depends on the language. I mean, I only speak that little bit of English, that's all. So, in other words, if I want to read, I don't know, a novel by Balzac, I have to read it in the German language. And so I cannot make that comparison. Now, I do agree that when it comes to English, let's say novels again, I hardly ever read any German translations. That has to do, I think, with the fact that, I live in Ireland as well, and, Ireland is so bloody rich in literature, you want to absorb it, so to speak, if you have the time to do so, ab origine, as we say in Latin. But let's say I want to read, I don't know, Tolstoy. What can I do? I have to. So it's not that. But when I do read a translation, I think one notices pretty soon whether, I wouldn't say now whether it's a bad or a good translation, but whether it's a translation that appeals to one or does not so appeal to one. And that, I think, happens quite often. It happens obviously in my translations. There is a little snag or a little, what would you say it? An infelicity, I call it, right? And everything is so hurried these days, that if quality control is being reduced, and it could well be, especially with the, shall we say, kind of genre literature, which doesn't have the highest literary demands, if you like, that the production is done at such a speed that you sometimes feel, a little bit more time, a little bit more care would have done the book good, But the same is true very often about the originals. I say the text is sacrosanct. But at the same time, the editorial processes are being curtailed. So quality of the originals, is of a problem. Can I just end there with one quote by our real patron saint, which is St. Jerome, who, as you know, translated the Bible from Greek into Latin, or from Hebrew into Latin, and no, from Greek only, sorry. And he said at the time, and that's something that we can repeat today, I am accused of a twofold crime. If I correct errors in the sacred text, I am denounced as a falsifier. If I do not correct them, I am pilloried as a disseminator of errors. And that is something that is really a tricky question that belongs to the domain of ethos, namely, if there are, factual errors in the original, okay, one can say that's to do with reality, I am entitled to correct it. But if there is a stylistic problem, am I supposed to just imitate it and therefore, make it live longer? Or shall I secretly give it my own little elegance? You know what I mean? It's very, very difficult. And you will be mercilessly judged by what you have produced. And there's no regard to the original that might also have been a little bit, what's the word? Flimsy, faulty. Okay.
Scott Fitzgerald couldn't spell, and he was dependent on his wife correcting the spelling. It didn't make his writing any less interesting, but it just, nowadays I suspect, if he was writing, it would get into print and he would be pilloried for the quality of his spelling.
I'm just collaborating with an Austrian colleague of mine, and she gave me the first pages that she translated, and I basically took the salt cellar and sprinkled commas in her text, because she said afterwards, yes, I haven't got a clue. And that's the one thing that I'm quite firm with, punctuation. I'm good at punctuation. The rest, forget it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Hans.
Thank you. Thank you.
If we have a chance to hear Hans later on this evening, debuting two new translations of two new translations of Paul Verhoeven's poems into German. And they're long poems. So Hans is going to read them in English and in German later on this evening across the St. Thomas's Church, starting at 8 o'clock, along with some other readers of Paul Verhoeven's poems, to mark his 80th birthday.
I would have run away.
So, time to go off and get a swim, and a burger if you find one, and then be back at the church at 8 o'clock.